Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 10 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 10, verse 21, through chapter 12, verse 28. We have been progressing through this plague-riddled negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh, wherein God's negotiation has largely been in the form of plagues. Moses and Pharaoh have been having a conversation around that. And we've seen Pharaoh reluctantly and very stubbornly giving some amount of ground that is no giving at all, right? Because as we've talked about, they're having a conversation that's not actually addressing the core issue in a negotiation, right? They both know that if Moses leads the people out into the wilderness, the intention is that they're not coming back. And so when Moses says, let us go worship our God out in the wilderness, although from the words, the implication is we're just going to go out and do that and come back. Everybody knows what they mean is let us go do that and then take off. And so as Pharaoh makes some concessions around this, so long as the concessions don't involve anything that allows that to happen, he's not really making the concession to, the thing they're talking about, right? So although he gives ground, sort of, in another very real sense, the core issue is still at an impasse, right? And they've made no progress at all because Pharaoh still doesn't want to let them go forever, and they still don't want to accept anything that's not letting them go forever. And so we've been stuck. And we've had various forms of negotiation. We've seen different tactics on both sides. We've seen Pharaoh kind of dug in, and the text isn't really very nice to him in terms of his attitude toward all of this. And we've talked some about what could be going on psychologically from his point of view, but from a very real other point of view, as long as these plagues aren't, from a cost-benefit analysis point of view, as long as these plagues aren't worse to continue to have happening than the free labor that he gets from all of these slaves, then at some point the scales haven't tipped yet, right? We really don't care for locusts, but they're going to go away eventually, and the slaves are still here. So I guess we'll have to tolerate it, right? The whole thing with plagues has been kind of weighing on a balance of God does something, but ultimately it doesn't seem like it's going to last forever. It hasn't touched Pharaoh that much personally, and the benefit of continuing to have the slaves so far has, in Pharaoh's mind, outweighed the cost of the plagues. And so you give Pharaoh a lot of crap for being a narcissist and, hardening his heart and all of this, but there's also a very rational analysis that could lead him to the same conclusion of not letting you go. So it's been it's in general been kind of a fascinating exchange, because really, if all the leverage Moses has is these plagues, so far, even if they are miraculous, they have not, Pharaoh doesn't care about miracle or not miracle, or who is the reigning God, right? It's been a contest of gods. Okay, your God is better than our gods. Great, but you're still our slaves. So, okay, agreed, your God is better than our gods. Now, go make some pyramids. And we can talk about theology when you're done working yourselves half to death, or more than half. We haven't gotten to a tipping point yet, right? And for a lot of reasons, and thus far, the leverage exerted by Moses and God, even with all of that, has not been sufficient to change that cost-benefit analysis from Pharaoh's point of view. We're through 8 plagues. There are 10. I think everybody knows. In case you don't know, this is where that's definitely not spoiling anything, because in this lesson we'll get through the 9th pretty quickly, and then we'll start laying the foundation of the 10th, which is the one that shifts that analysis. We don't get to Pharaoh's reaction to it. We don't get to the actual 10th plague, but we spend a lot of time getting ready for it, which we need to do because it's the big one, right? It's the one that changes how all of that works. So many of these plagues have shown in various capacities God's power over life and death, right? If you know, the Egyptians have, this is the god of the sun and the god of the Nile, and the god of snakes and the god of crops or whatever. And all these gods of different little earth nature things. The God of the Israelites was and is the God of life and death, right? That's at the heart of our covenant, our relationship with God, the problems of sin, what it means to be human, what it means more in our ultimate destiny that we're human, who Jesus Christ is, at the center of all of how we relate to God is life and death. If you had to take a thing and say ours is the God of these things, especially in the Old Testament, before Jesus comes and says, "Love one another as I have loved you, so also shall you love one another," etc. And some of those viewpoints that show more clearly how God is love. Before we get to that as kind of the fulfillment of all of this, and that becomes more clear, the thing very clearly that God is in the Old Testament is God of life and death. And nowhere will that be clearer than in this 10th plague that we'll be getting ready for, which is, we'll get into, but it sets precedent over life and death that lasts for all time. Part of the reason the Passover is so important is immediately firstborn are either killed or redeemed, right? Through the offering of the Passover feast, the sacrifice of the lamb, the painting of blood on the doorway. All firstborn, God says, God of life and death, are under the ban, are subject to death. You can, however, selectively redeem some of those doomed people through an offering and blood, and a meal that goes along with it. It never stops being true that especially firstborn's lives are owed to God. It becomes an essential part of the religious practice of these people, starting now, that every firstborn of flock and birds and people must be redeemed because the lives forever from this time onward belong to God. Symbolically and beyond that, that is the state of our relationship with God, right? All of our lives belong to and are in the hands of God. And all are, through sin, subject to death, and all must be redeemed. So, the core idea of this is the core idea of the problem of the state of humanity, summarized and reduced to only the firstborn, but it is in micro a reflection of the macro problem of all people. So, just firstborn of just the Israelites come to represent the state of everyone born of all people. And it's the idea of original sin is also contained here, right? From the moment you're born, you are subject to death. without being redeemed, right? The idea of it being tied to firstborn and thereby to birth itself, and people are redeemed after birth, is an idea of you come into this world already in debt, right? And needing to be redeemed. Thanks, see the previous book, back to that original sin. And this is the state of humanity. So we see inherent here an idea that a person born in sin, subject at birth to death, can be by a sacrifice redeemed. Powerful idea, right? Immediately in the history of these people, we start setting up, as we create a people of God, we start setting up this foundational idea that we know the covenant is if you sin, you die. We know the problem of all of these people is they've all sinned, so they're all subject to death. In the short run, there is a way to forestall that death by paying that price that is owed, a death, with a proxy, with something else, right? With a sacrifice. We take for granted that that's the thing that exists, but this is where that starts to exist, is you've got a life owed to God, and you can pay it with another life, and at least forestall that death that is owed. That foundation matters greatly. It's going to become the center of religious practice here for these people. But of course, as we know, there's only the one sacrifice that's really able to redeem and to make amends. And it's not a cow. It's Jesus Christ, or a sheep, or pick your favorite animal. It doesn't work. Because the debt is too big and repeats too much. See study of Romans or Hebrews or the New Testament for more on how only Jesus can successfully pay that debt that's owed and why. But for here, the important part is we're laying a framework, right? And the framework is the idea that for whatever reason, ultimately sin, but in the plagues it's not even looked at as that. For whatever reason, all firstborn, just no matter what, are owed to God, right? Their lives, God decides, hey, we're doing plagues. This one is, I'm reminding you that all of your firstborn belong to me. And life and death over them is my discretion, and they all deserve to die. Because all have sinned, all are dead. As with the other plagues, the powerful thing isn't the going into it, right? Isn't that the Nile is suddenly full of blood. The powerful thing is some of it's not. Now it's not bloody anymore, all of a sudden. Pharaoh's magicians could make blood, but they could, or snakes, but they couldn't make clean water or a staff from the snakes, right? Any dummy can make someone dead. No one can make someone who's dead not dead, right? So as with these other plagues, the really cool thing about the Passover isn't that people who are already dead in sin end up dying in the world as well, because that was inevitable and would happen regardless of God's intervention, just on a different timeline. The powerful and important thing about this plague, as with the others, is that there are some people who are not dead. And that's new. That's, since Adam and Eve, there have not been people who are not dead. And now all of a sudden, you're carving out firstborn of the Israelites who can be subject to that death, and God can say, no, we're going to pass over that. We're going to skip that. We're going to take this sacrifice in exchange for that and say that works to pay the debt, and you can be not dead. That's a new and a profound and an important thing. That's why we have so much here with the preparation for it is the rules by which anything can be not dead right now are very, very limited, right? God, we're building a foundation on very strict rules, which is why this liturgy becomes so important, right? It is a liturgical act that alters the rules of life and death. That's still true now, by the way. It's still always a liturgical act that alters the rules of life and death. God uses liturgical forms to do that in the ordinary means, like only, which is part of why the sacraments and our liturgical forms are so important, right? Those are where the outcome of life and death, like if you just leave everything going as normal, is changed, right? Something steps in, God touches reality, and things that are dead are made alive, right? Like happens in the Passover, happens through other liturgical acts still now as well. It's an incredible and a profound thing. This is the first instance of that that we're setting up, so it gets time and attention. So, finishing up plagues, as we do so, worth remembering that the letting up of the plague is the more profound thing than the causing of the plague, because it'll give us a new and an important perspective as we get into the 10th one. And here in this lesson, we'll be laying the foundation of that Passover, and we'll get to the 10th plague in the next lesson. The 9th plague goes really fast, right? Like blink and you'll miss it kind of fast here in the text, because we're already, the 10th one is so big, it's not worth spending too much time even in the text on the 9th one. And B, I think you can argue that the two go pretty well together for reasons we'll talk about presently. So what is this 9th plague? It is darkness, right? Some things we can take for granted now. Moses does it. Moses is the one talking to Pharaoh. By this point in the exchange, Aaron is out of the picture, like to the point that we don't even know that he's around. We're assuming he is, but like it's all Moses at this point. So that maturation and growth of Moses' arc is kind of where it's going to get, right? Like Moses, where these plagues started, and Moses, where they are now, different guy, right? Like he's come a long way. Whether Pharaoh has had a conversion experience or not, he hasn't. Whether Aaron has had a conversion experience or not, he hasn't. Whether the people have had a conversion experience or not, they haven't. Moses has, right? Like all of this, so who's all of this been for? Maybe Moses. Although it's a foundation that's helpful for all of the Israelites later, and it's important. But like everybody going through the same thing, Moses is the one who's really transformed by it, and continues to be by his relationship with God. That's kind of a side note at this point, because Moses' arc is the first half of this book is really Moses' arc. Now that he is Moses, as we later know him looking back, like the rest of the arc is Moses trying to then make the people go through a similar conversion and get to a point that they likewise can rightfully claim to be people of God, which is not tied just to things like circumcision, but to behavior. He has much better luck with himself than he does with them. Spoiler. But that's the rest of this is Moses trying to get the people to be more like Moses. We'll see. But it's noteworthy as a turning point that we've completed the one arc. We're at the transition point, and we're about to start the arc of trying to really create the people of God. And we're right at the hinge point between the two right now, and will be for a little while. But as we pick up that growth arc again, it'll be on the people and not on Moses. Dark for 3 days where the Egyptians are and not where the Israelites are. That should be familiar by now, except darkness is a new thing. 3 days should help us make some kind of connection to what's going on here, right? Like, so if the Passover, which is timing-wise also connected to Jesus' death and resurrection, and thematically, God chose to die and rise again. He could have done that whenever he wanted to. He chose to do that in conjunction with the Passover. He was dead for 3 days, darkness, and rose again, light, right? Like plagues 9 and 10 here are both intimately connected with where this ultimately lands, right? Which is why I say, thematically, these are very connected. But for now, like, there's also, if you've heard of one Egyptian god from movies, from television, from anywhere, it's probably Ra, the sun god, right? For whatever reason, that's the one that persists as the biggest deal and is most in our consciousnesses. People have nothing to do with that. So this is, if we're, if we have a combat of gods going on, it's also true that, like, this is kind of the coup de grace in that whole situation as well. So it's dark. And Pharaoh, again, is willing to give some ground that's not giving ground at all, right? Okay, you can take everybody, all the people can go, but you're leaving all the cattle. Again, a means of trying to, if you do that, we know you're coming back, right? Because you won't get very far without, cattle are not only food, but also basically money, right? So if you leave without your cattle, you don't have any possessions, and you have this whole group of a lot of people, that doesn't end well, right? So we know you're coming back if you go out and you leave your herds behind. So you can do that. I will seed ground. That, of course, seeds no ground at all. And so that is where we're leaving that bit of negotiation. Predictably, Moses is not interested in leaving the flocks behind. They're going out to sacrifice, after all, and they need animals for the sacrifice, and they couldn't possibly know which ones in advance, because God will make that request known to them when they get out very far from Egypt and continue going farther, and don't come back. But we couldn't possibly know which animals need to be sacrificed before we get out there, so not a hoof shall be left behind, because that could be the one God wants. Again, they both know what they're talking about, right? But neither one is saying it. Pharaoh's not saying, I don't actually mind if you all go out and sacrifice as long as you're coming back. And Moses is not actually saying, yeah, we're going and not coming back. But that's still the core, that's still the heart of this conflict. So, of course, Pharaoh says, well, yeah, no, not happening, because I know if you take your herds, you're not coming back. So, no, my answer, as always, is no, I'm not letting your people go. I'm not letting you just leave Egypt and be not here. Like, we can squabble about details all we want to. You can go sacrifice if you want. You can't just leave, though. And no amount of plagues are going to change that. Let's just leave it over and stop. I'm done. I'm not letting you leave. Period. It's not going to happen. Let's stop talking about it. If you next time you see me, I'm going to kill you. If you see my face, for in the day you see my face, you shall die, which is also, conflating Pharaoh with God, because you cannot see the face of God and live is a thing that fascinatingly, doesn't seem to apply to Moses the same way it does to every other person until Jesus. So Moses, who uniquely can see the face of God and not die, Pharaoh is saying, well, you can't see mine and live. Like, Pharaoh, are you greater than God? No, definitely not. So Moses says, okay, have it your way. I don't want to see your face again anyway. Okay, but I'm still going to win. We don't have to talk about it anymore, but yeah, bye. It's been nice knowing you. And, I'll be happy not to have to continue this fruitless conversation. And we'll just go. This is interesting. So, the plague is going to happen. We hear more about the consequences of the plague than we do initially, I'm going to do another plague and then he's going to let you go. Not, this is the plague I'm going to do in the details. We start with, this is going to be the one. We're going to have another plague, and then not only is he going to let you go, he's going to drive you out. Before we get to what the plague is, why don't you go around? If you remember when we started this, there was a sign that I was going to give you, but some of the foreshadowing was, you were going to despoil the Egyptians on your way out. It's time to do that. Get the people to go around and ask all of their Egyptian neighbors to hand over all of their valuables. Interestingly, before the last plague happens, right? So the implication, and we think back, if you're not clear on the details, it seems like the firstborn died. The Egyptians were like, I've had enough of this. Here, take my stuff and you can go. But there's been no mention yet of killing of the firstborn, and the Egyptians still hand over their stuff. They have a very different view of what has happened than Pharaoh does, right? It notes here, moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. Pharaoh is not buying this at all, but the Egyptians are, right? They're convinced that God and Moses are a big deal. And so when Moses says, hey, Egyptian guys, give us your stuff, they say, take it. Yeah, okay. Before the 10th plague, we have gotten to a point where the Egyptians are on, you think there could almost, without rulers, be a way that everybody could at this point live together in peace. But that's of course not what we're doing, and it's not what happens. But clearly the minds of the Egyptian people about God and the Israelites have changed a lot through the course of these plagues. And they're at the very least not terribly willing to mess with the Israelites. And so they are despoiled before the last plague, and willingly, due to the regard they hold Moses and God in. Right? Nobody's holding a gun or a sword to their throats. They're just saying, hey, could we have your stuff? And the Egyptians say, certainly. Yeah, okay. It's such an odd thing, but the things that failed to change the heart of Pharaoh did not fail to change the hearts of his people, who did not have their hearts hardened the same way that he did, which is just neat. And we'll see that it matters later that these spoils, a lot of them don't go to the people who are taking them. A lot of them go in service of God, which is, so the things that are given are ultimately given, a large portion of them to God. So that'll come up later, but it's also, this is just such an odd aside, right? And worth noting that it happens before we even know in the text what the 10th plague is. We don't know yet. I spoiled it, because, we all know. But we don't know yet in the text what it is. And this is still happening. So we're about to know. So here we have what this 10th plague consists of. About midnight, in the middle of the night when it's darkest, God, will go forth in the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn will die, of people regardless of status and of animals. And the firstborn of the Israelites will not die. And then they're going to let you go. There will be a cry such as never has been heard before and never will be again in the land of Egypt. And they will, at that time, let you go. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get you out, and all the people who follow you. The one that they're kicking out is not the people, it's God, right? They're going to say, we don't want God here. And so all of you that he's with have to go, because this God, your God is too much for us. That's the answer to the clashing of gods, is ultimately they say, okay, your God wins, but we don't want him here. There's another choice that could be made there. It's not the one they're going to make, we know, but sometimes not everybody who believes in or who acknowledges the power of God chooses to serve him. Those are two different things that are sometimes confused. The devil believes in God, right? And knows and understands God. He will not serve God. In our own lives, the choice, we put too much weight on the intellectual idea of belief in God, because more and more there are people who don't. But so we think it's sufficient to be Christian that we believe in God, and that is decidedly not true. It is very possible to believe in God and to take the position of the Egyptians here. God, I believe in and acknowledge you, and that frightens me. And I don't want you involved in what I'm doing. I think we're very rarely willing to admit to ourselves when that's happening, but I think probably a lot more of us than would at first be expected have those thoughts and reactions. How many of you watching this have had a situation where you know what you think you ought to be doing for God in your life, and decide you want to do something else because the idea of going God's way, it just scares you, right? Like, my life would be so different and I can't do that, right? Like, but it's not that you don't know that God is behind something that's going on. It's that you look at that and you refuse. Because you're overwhelmed or intimidated by the direction that God seems to be leading, and you decide not to go, or not to obey. Believing in and accepting that God is real and powerful is not enough. The point is to obey and to follow, to trust, to have faith. And I think because there has been so much crisis of belief at all, the goalpost for Christians is really shifted to, do you believe in God? And not to, are you living a life of faith? And the difference is so huge. Like, in fact, I would venture to guess that some of those people who don't believe in God will have an easier time on Judgment Day than many who do, and who have, while believing, chosen not to serve. And that's where, in our lives as Christians, we should be focusing on, right? Are we saying yes? Are we acknowledging, believing in God are we acknowledging that that comes with obligations on us? Are we saying, yes, God, okay, I accept you, and I want you as my God, not just as God, and as everything that entails? Or are we saying, too much, get out, go away from me and my life, and be God over there, and be not my God? And not just like at the all-in level of all or nothing, but in each individual situation in our lives. Are we saying, yes, you're my God, I want you in charge of and with me in this thing that I'm doing? Or not this one, God, but you can be God here, but not God here. And in this, you should get out. But, if you want to help me find a job, that where I make a bunch of money, and a super hot partner, and you can help me do these things, and you can be God of helping me live my life my way. But as soon as you want to be God of upheaving all of that and me having you as God your way, then get away. Like, how often do we set terms on that, right? And at some point, the Egyptians are faced with the reality of who God is, and they can't handle it. In their case, that is incredibly understandable. Pharaoh has a large amount of culpability here. The day-to-day Egyptians, not much at all. That would be a hard thing too. The Egyptians in general, because they're not the ones making the decisions, and because of how these plagues are affecting them, are excused more than Pharaoh for not wanting anything to do with God in terms of what's happening. But from our point of view, the relevant point here is how easy it is to see God acting and to send him away instead of inviting him in farther. Anyway, we're going to have a 10th plague. As we're about to move out of the plagues, this is just a summary of what we've been through, right? Pharaoh not listening to Moses and Aaron, despite all the wonders that have been happening. A reminder that Moses and Aaron did all the wonders, even though lately Aaron hasn't been involved. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he repeatedly didn't let people go, right? We're wrapping up the chapter. We're about to move into the one with the 10th plague, and that is a summary of where we have been so far. As we pick up this next chapter that leads us toward the last plague, there's a decided shift in tone. We are now outlining the liturgical rite of the feast that comes about as a result of this. And while it's presented as describing in advance what to do, and it does some of that, it also reads very much like it's being written after this feast is well established, and it's, laying out all of up front things that may be developed a little bit after the fact. A theme that will be repeating through much of the second half of the book of Exodus as we're laying down liturgy and law. It's likely that this wasn't so formalized right when it was started, though it certainly could have been. But it's very helpful that we're connecting here where it begins with what it became for these people. It's certainly not bad that that's happening. It's really helpful. So what does this turn into? The first month, this becomes the first part of the calendar year for these people. It is their beginning. There are many different beginnings in the Bible for different situations. Obviously, there's the beginning of all things. There weren't months yet, so nobody was tracking what month that was. This is where you have a people of God, right? So you are starting anew as having a people of God that have a direct relationship with God, that are delivered from slavery to Pharaoh in order, in theory, to belong to God. They don't have a choice as to whether they belong to someone, only to whom. And they are choosing to belong to God rather than to Pharaoh. And that sets the course for these people. It is a beginning. It is... So it's very appropriate then that we're setting this up so that it begins the calendar year. Then what do? You need a lamb, and not just any lamb. It has to be without blemish, a year old. A lamb can apply to a number of different kinds of livestock, and if your family's too small, you can share it. But it is essential that the thing that you have to have for this to occur is you have to have a lamb. Even now, within our liturgy, especially within our sacraments, they require matter and form to be effective, right? There is a thing like in baptism, right? The matter involved in baptism is water, right? You can't baptize someone validly without water. So that it's an essential part of that liturgical rite. Here, an essential part of that of the rite of the Passover, for reasons that we will see, is that you have to have a lamb. And we'll see what happens with it. So, first thing you need, a lamb, meeting certain criteria. Second thing, what do you do with the lamb? We skip over they kill it in the evening. We saw at the end of the last part. So there's time-specific involvement in when it dies. And then, how is a day reckoned according to their calendar? So it's in the evening, right? So it's at sundown. So you are leading up to the time that you're eating this meal is leading up to a day, right? Like you've got your preparation period leading up to sundown, and so your preparation period is leading up to sundown and the eating of your feast. And then you have kicked off the longer period that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where you still aren't eating leavened bread. The idea being, looking back, you're getting ready to leave Egypt, and then you're traveling, and so you don't have time to like bake bread, right? Or to have the period of the week of unleavened bread is all symbolic of the time that you're leaving Egypt. And for the Israelites, actually is a bigger deal than the part of it that is Passover. As Christians, we have ascribed a tremendous amount of importance to the Passover due to its connection with the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we underemphasize, at least in most of the places that I've been, the part that comes after that. But it's useful to remember that for the Israelites in their celebration, the octave of time after that that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that celebrates the time they were leaving being enslaved and journeying into freedom, was a bigger deal than the Passover part that started it off. And we also celebrate an octave of Easter, and potentially, just because everybody's going to church throughout all of the Triduum, people, I think we tend to ascribe a bigger importance to that because we're doing more. But it's, strictly speaking, not necessarily correct. And even as Christians, like the period after the resurrection of Jesus and immediately what that means for us is a bigger deal, right? Like the Passover stuff only matters because of what happens after. The Triduum stuff only matters because of what happens at Easter, which we celebrate as an octave of 8 days. It still should be true that the fuller 8-day feast is more significant than the little bit that leads up to that, although of course it's all so interconnected. There's also an interesting timing thing here that I won't dive into great depth on, but it's worth making note of. We tie the time of Jesus' death to this preparation period for the Passover. We also like to talk about the Last Supper being the Passover meal. Only one of those things can be true, right? The Last Supper came before Holy Thursday comes before Good Friday, right? If Jesus' death was part of sacrificing the Passover lamb, then the meal would come after that. It would come like between Good Friday and Holy Saturday, and not on Holy Thursday. So either, from a timing point of view, Holy Thursday is a Passover meal, meaning the sacrifice had already happened, and then you're having your Passover meal, which seems not fitting at all, or Jesus is killed when the lambs are being sacrificed, leading up to the feasts, and then the Holy Thursday meal that is Jesus' Last Supper is not a Passover meal, which is the way more likely way of viewing that. In the Gospel according to John, it's for sure that. In the Synoptic Gospels, it's a little less clear. It's an interesting thing to think about because we make assumptions about the things that are going on there because we're less familiar about what's going on in the original story, right? And we mix up some of that timing and what can go when and where and how. But strictly speaking, you've got your period of preparation, which is where we're at right now, where you kill the animal and you're getting the feast ready, and then you paint the door and you eat the feast. And then you've entered the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that kicks that off. And the Passover meal comes that evening, that night, after the preparation period. So what are they doing? You've got a lamb, that's the thing you have to have. It's killed, that is the thing that has to happen. Why does that have to happen? Because a life is owed to God, right? This is all, in the background of all of this is the idea that death is coming, right? That death reigns and is coming. And you're doing a thing to try to forestall, to delay it, to cause it to pass over you. And so a life is owed. As we're starting this, the life that is owed is yours. And then you can take this lamb that meets very specific criteria. You can kill the lamb in your place. It's not enough to just kill the lamb, though. Then you need to do a particular thing. This sets up the idea that blood plays a really important role in liturgy in occasions where there is an exchange of life, right? It wasn't sufficient that you just killed the lamb. You're painting blood along the doorpost, which is not a thing they repeat. That part happens the one time. They don't do it when they commemorate the feast. They don't sprinkle the blood. That was a one-off. But that idea is, lest the angel of God get confused, as he's going around and physically going in all these houses and killing. He'll see, oh, this one's got this price has been paid, right? The blood is a sign that indicates you've already been paid here, right? So invoice marked, paid in full for this month or this year. Come back next year and see if it's still paid, right? That's the big difference between animal sacrifice and the sacrifices of Jesus Christ. Is you're like on an installment plan here, where you have to keep paying your invoice every time it's due, and it keeps coming due. Whereas with Jesus, the debt is paid in full, and there's not a need for continued installments to be made. But here, the lamb's blood marks the debt has been paid. And so the angel can pass by. And then the feast part of it has to do with not the passing over of death, but what comes next. You're going to be removed from Egypt at this point. Not only are you going to be allowed to go, you're going to be removed. They will not want you here. So you have to eat standing up, ready to travel. You're preparing food in a way that you don't get to take any of it with you. Anything you don't eat that night, you can't eat. It's gone. And you have to prepare everything in a way that does not take substantial amount of time to prepare. All of that because you are doing it in preparation, not just to eat, but to leave. And so those are the two kind of conjoined parts of this feast are, one, you're paying life for life with the lamb, and two, with the meal, you are preparing yourself to leave Egypt and to journey into the promised land. Again, I think when we celebrate this feast of Easter, we put a lot of focus on the first part of that, right? On the killing of the offering of the life in exchange for life. And we put a whole lot less emphasis on that means that now you need to leave the land of slavery and journey into the promised land. It so happens that in the Eucharist, the meal and the sacrifice join into one in a way we're less familiar with. It's less clear that we're eating a I'm leaving meal, right, in the Eucharist, but that is what's happening. And that should be food and strength for the journey as well. And we should again be using the period of the octave and all of the period of Easter with the focus on leaving our previous state of slavery and journeying toward the promised land. In what will also become familiar as we move through the second half of the book of Exodus, as things get very important, they get repetitive, lest there be any confusion, which I think is excellent. Here we see a summary of what, and a second description through some of those key points that were just laid out and were just talked about. Firstborn are going to die. The blood is a sign that your debt has been paid, and death will pass you by. And you're meant to do this forever, through every generation. That was less clear. It was kind of clear it was being set up as a feast, but this is a perpetual. This is a forever feast. Which note we still do. God means it when He says that you're doing this forever. You can leave behind the Israelite worship practices, but you don't leave this behind because ours come out of that. So we still have to do this. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. This is where you get into that feast of unleavened bread. And on the first day you shall put away leaven from your houses. But you're doing including the preparation day, you've got 8 days here. Like we have an octave of Easter now. Easter and then another week after that. And again, as the point that I got ahead of myself on a little bit with this octave thing, for them, the bigger deal is the 7 days after. And for us, likewise, there is cause as we get to Easter to renew our emphasis on what happens during that Easter week. Yet again, lest there be any confusion about this thing, we're going to have holy assemblies on both sides. Easter Sunday, Sunday after. Yep, Divine Mercy is the Sunday after now. You're not the preparation, but the Passover meal that starts a new day, and then the end of your feast. And throughout all of that time, you'll have your major assemblies, and then the rest of the time, you're not eating leaven. You don't have leaven in your houses. And it seems like, this seems a little extreme, but it's like a be cut off from your people level of offense if, you had that sourdough starter hanging out in the back of your fridge, right? Like, obviously that's not how they did things back then, and so it would have had to be very deliberate. But it's like, no matter what, like, no leaven in your house, and definitely don't cook with it, because obviously God doesn't care about leaven, right? Just like God doesn't care about shellfish. Some of these things, or pork, some of these things eventually don't matter, and God doesn't care about what they are, especially when leaven's fine the rest of the time. What you're saying, if you keep the leaven, or if you continue to eat unleavened bread, or continue to eat leavened bread, that takes time, to make the bread rise and all of that, is that you're not preparing to take the journey, right? Both initially and in the memorial, if you're doing things that are symbolizing, that are saying, I'm comfortable settling in to where I am, then that is contrary to the feast, right? The point of the memorial of the feast is you're not only calling to mind what happened before, but you're joining yourself to it and saying, yes, I'm ready to leave where I have been and to journey with God to a new land. You have to be ready to take that journey every time you celebrate the feast, every time you commemorate the feast. So if you are then doing things with your life during that period that say, I'm good where I am, then you're saying, I'm not willing to take that journey with my people, right? It's the symbolism of the leaven is not the point of it. The point of it is, during that time, are we, during the Easter time, willing to uproot our lives and to follow God? Or are we more than happy to settle in and to be comfortable where we are and to keep doing things the way we are? And if your answer is, I like things the way they are, I want my bread leavened, then you're cut off from the people. You can't be the people of God and do that. So you have to be willing and mark it at least once a year, be willing to upheave everything. That's probably not how that verb works, isn't it? It's not transitive. To have your life go through that upheaval, and to leave behind where you've been and what you've been doing, and to journey into a new land, trusting entirely in God. And leaven ends up being a symbol of that. So does God care about leaven? Not at all. Does God care about that? Yes. Why is the bread that we eat in the Eucharist unleavened? Does God care about leaven? No. So what is it saying that the Eucharist, the bread that we eat, is unleavened? It's saying this is food for a journey, right? A journey out of the comfort of the lives that we're currently in and toward the promised land, trusting entirely in the providence of God. It is food for that journey. And likewise, it would be, you cannot consume the Eucharist and say, I want to be stuck where I am and to stay where I am. And so that bread cannot be leavened. And so our hearts as we receive it cannot be leavened, right? Cannot be content and happy where we are and willing to just continue the status quo. And so likewise, it's not about God hating leaven. It's about what that represents. And that symbolism matters as much today as it did in this first Passover feast. We've carried it over differently in that it's part of every liturgy we celebrate. It's not just a thing to do once a year. It is a thing to do daily. That's how important this is. Further summary here and wrap up, right? Again, lest there be any confusion about what's going on. You're taking a lamb. It's the Passover lamb. You're going to kill it. You're going to grab some hyssop. You're going to dip it in the blood. You're going to sprinkle it on the doorpost. That's how God's going to know to pass over your house. Then you're going to stay in that house because he's not going to necessarily pass over you if you're out on the street. It's the house is the thing that's made safe by the blood. You have to be in the house. The church is the thing that's made safe by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. You have to be in the church to be passed over. Not the building of the church, the institution of the sacramental body of Christ, institution of the church. And I don't even mean like the earthly, like administrative political body. That's not that either. That's the sacramental body of Christ thing. You've got to be in the building still, right? The building just isn't a building anymore. And marked with that blood. So stay inside, right? It doesn't matter if the lamb was killed. If you go outside, then you're no longer under that protection. Death will still get you. Very specific rules again, right? Governing life and death. And it's worth noting it's the place that is made immune to death and not the people. If you leave the place, you leave the protection. Because that's still how it works. So the angel of the Lord will go through and he'll see the blood and he'll say, oh, that one was paid. And he'll move on. You're going to do this forever. Because A, it's a symbol, but B, it's not, right? Like, it's a symbol and it's a reminder of the thing that happened back in Egypt. Okay, great. It's also true that all of your lives are still subject to God and you belong to him and you all are still marked for death. And we still want God to pass over us when that preordained death comes. And it could be any night. It could be tonight when death comes to all to whom it is due. That's all this is death is due to all of these people, and God is just realizing it. Again, the important part of it isn't that people who are doomed die. It's that some people who are doomed don't die. Because of the, really glaring manifestation of death, we think more about the people dying than the people living. But the big deal is you make your house something that is, and it's the building and not the people, that is capable of protecting the people in it from death. The people are still deserving of death, right? Again, it's the people aren't fixed. It's the house that's made safe. So you stay in the safe house, and even though, the safe house, but yes, even though you are doomed, God won't go in that house to execute on the judgment. We are still doomed, but within the confines of the church, God will pass over that. The debt has been paid. You're still not somebody who, left to your own devices, is free from. You still merit death. I still merit death. Left to my own devices, the things I've done should lead to my death. And nothing God has done has changed that, right? Like, I still, on my own, have merited and will again merit death. But within the confines of the church, which has been marked by the blood of Christ, I am safe despite that, and God will pass over. And that's the thing here that is accomplished, that is miraculous. Isn't the death of many people who are doomed. It's the saving of many other people who are equally doomed. And so this should be done as a perpetual ordinance, not only to remind us that it happened once, but to remind us that it happened through other sacrificial means for the people of Israel for many, many years, and that it happens daily for us, and constantly in the church as well. And that it's only through the sacrifice of Christ that the church has been marked out as a safe place which death will pass over, and that our living and staying within the confines of that church are the only things that are guaranteeing that we have life in the face of very merited death. This has been an overview of Lesson 10 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.